Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to make this video mostly about the Katz book and some things that I want to say about it, why I think it's such an important book, not just for this course, but in general in terms of understanding Jewish connections to non-Jews throughout the ages. Also, some introductory remarks a little bit later, perhaps, about our lesson for this coming week. We're moving into some new period of time, some different kinds of things, going to cover a couple of centuries very quickly, some interesting different kinds of things that you'll be reading for this week, and also some different kinds of questions. I think that I hope you will enjoy them. So I want to talk to you about the Katz book and some of the basic issues that he wants to talk about. Essentially, Katz is really looking at the question of what has been the way Jewish attitudes to non-Jews, the Jewish attitude to the other, has developed over the years. Particularly, he's looking at Northern Europe. So Spain is really not part of his conversation. On the other hand, some of his stuff is in fact pertinent to Spain. I think that in the overall way to look at it is that the situation is bilateral. It's not just that we have Christian anti-Semitism. It's not just that the Christians are nasty to the Jews, as they are in Northern Europe. But the Jews come to this with their own approach, with their own self-understanding, and who they become in this process is in many ways shaped by who the non-Jew is, but it's shaped by Jewish tradition as well. It's shaped also by the reality that they're living in. And I think that the whole question, the doctrinal question, the question of who we are as Jews as related to the question of who the Christians are, is also pertinent to this. I think some of you commented on Katz's point at the beginning that the need to be separate was not just a Christian thing, it was also a Jewish thing. Each culture had its own perspective, its own way of being in the world, and its own sense of threat by the opposing culture, by the other group. So I want to start by looking at this question of who the other is in the Middle Ages, who the other is in general for the Jew. How does the Jew in that period, in the rabbinic period, in the medieval period, and in fact in the modern period, how do we think about what the other is? How do we think about who the other is and what kind of human being they are? Are they human beings like we are? In the rabbinic period, there was an approach that said that the other who is an idolater, not all others are idolaters, but the other who is an idolater has a different kind of status and does not exactly approach the same status as that of the Jews. Therefore, there are various rules and restrictions that relate to that person. It's not clear whether that really has to do also with our moral obligations to that person, but it's really more in the context of not wanting to be influenced, not wanting that the idolater whose rules, whose laws, whose morality is somewhat suspect. We don't want to have to come into contact with them, and we don't want to support what they're doing. So there are a variety of rules regarding the economic relations which Jews have with the idolater, other kinds of relations with the idolater. The Jews are really supposed to be separate from them, and in fact they were able to be in the rabbinic period. The Jews were able to sustain themselves for the most part economically without having to have ongoing relations with non-Jews. This actually begins to change in Babylonia, and in fact some of the rules begin to change. But it really does change in Europe. When the Jews come to Europe, particularly Northern Europe, where Jewish communities were very small, and you couldn't really survive without having ongoing economic relations with the non-Jews. So how do the Jews deal with this problem? And that's what's so interesting here. How does the Jewish community deal with it? How do the rabbis deal with it? And so on. And what Katz does as a kind of sociological historian, he sort of looks at the documents, he looks at the responsa literature, he looks at all of this, and what he finds is that what happens is something that we notice in religions in general, we notice it in Judaism too, that the people change their behavior in order to survive, in order to make a life for themselves there. And then the Jewish tradition and Jewish law acknowledges that and makes the changes there after the fact. So they don't actually go to the rabbi and say, can we do this? Maybe they did, but they didn't necessarily listen to the rabbi. They actually do what is necessary in order to survive, in order to be able to make a living, to support their families, and so on. And then the rabbis come in and try to work through a way to make it possible, according to Judaism, according to Jewish law, that survival does not mean that they are going against tradition, that survival does not mean that they have to live their lives knowing that they're breaking the law, that they're breaking the tradition, and so on. So the rabbis go in and try to find kulot, it would be called, ways that will make the law not so stringent, make it possible for Jews, in fact, to have this ongoing economic relations with non-Jews. What is fascinating in the Katz series of essays is that almost all of the responses are not generic responses to say, well, the non-Jews are really in a different category, and therefore, or we're living at a different time, and therefore it's okay to do whatever you want to do with them. They do make some of these pronouncements, but as Katz tries to show, even the one that Hameiri makes later on, that is fairly generic about these are nations that are bound by the laws of religion, even that is not intended to be a generic kula, a generic way to ease all of these things. And what happens is they find some interesting things as they try to open up the conversation and open up the behavior. One is they say, well, we're living in a different time. What was an idolater then qualified in a certain way, but we're living in a different time. So therefore, we can't really say that the people who live today are idolaters the same way they were 1,000 years ago. Another thing that they say, which actually is directly relevant, is that that the situation now is sha'at chak. That means it's a time of emergency. Without doing this, we wouldn't be able to survive. We know that in matters of life and death, we're able to set aside these laws. So let's just call this sha'at chak. This is a time of emergency, and we can set aside the law. And then the third approach is the one I mentioned, the one developed by Hameiri, which does make a distinction between Christians and Muslims and everybody else, just as Muslims made a distinction between Jews and Christians and everybody else, right? As the dhimmi population. So the Jews call them umot hagedurot. These are people who do have laws. Their beliefs about God and so on are still not anything that we would like to approve of, but they have rules about behavior. They're moral. They have rules that their religion sets down, and it's not like the old idolaters who did horrible things all the time. So there was a certain sense with Hameiri and earlier that these people with whom we live are actually human beings. They are somehow like us, and therefore these old rules about economic intercourse can be put aside in order for us to be able to make a living, but they also have implications. It means that we can have relationships, we can have regular economic relations, we can go into business with them, we can do all kinds of things with them. So the other, in this case, is much less confrontational, is much less forbidding. On the other hand, we see also in the Katz material that they recognize that this could have bad consequences. and that's this chapter on social and religious segregation. The rules regarding social interaction and otherwise from the rabbinic period were actually made more stringent by the medieval rabbis. They really wanted to protect the Jewish community in ways that they could from having too much of this social relations and too much in terms of religious relations as well, because they recognized if we are allowing all of this economically, and we allow all of this socially and in other ways, then the chances that bad things might happen as a result of this, whether it's conversion or whether it's assimilation or whether it's taking on the other, the practices of the other, that can be a very bad thing. So there's a kind of balancing act that they do. On the one hand, opening things up economically, and on the other hand, making things just as stringent, in fact, even more stringent on the other basis. So we have the beginnings of this sense of small communities trying to figure out how do we maneuver ourselves during this period of time. In Spain, they were dealing with some of the same kinds of questions too. But in Northern Europe, this was how they began to look at it. And there were certain rulings, I mentioned, I think, in my introduction, which are a little bit haunting to me. The reason why you don't cheat an idolater is not because you have a moral obligation not to cheat the idolater, but because it would be a chilul Hashem. It would be a desecration of God's name that his people act immorally towards these other people. So the idea here being that it's a kiddush Hashem. It's a kiddush, it's a sanctification of God's name to behave morally towards your non-Jewish neighbor. And of course, the term Kiddush Hashem becomes used later on in the Middle Ages, and including all the way through till today, to refer to martyrdom. When a Jew submits himself to martyrdom in the face of activity of the non-Jew who are forcing them to do one thing or the other. In the Middle Ages, they might be trying to force them to convert. Their refusal to convert is an act of martyrdom, and that same word is used, Kiddush Hashem. So in this sense, this Katz book opens up for us a way of talking about the other, a way for Jews to be talking about the other. This will continue into the modern period where we will be sort of both reflecting what other people are saying about the Jews and trying to develop the Jewish response in their own way. The other thing that we begin to see here already is that there's lots of influence, there's lots of impact of what happens in the non-Jewish world into the Jewish world as well. And it happens even the idea of dhimmi can be mirrored in the Jewish understanding of umot hagdurot. The nations are bound by the rules of religion, and so on. So I just wanted to open that up. I think your comments in general were quite striking and insightful. I shared a good bit of that. I don't know that I need to go over it now orally. I also want to talk about the lesson that's coming up, which brings us into what's called the early modern period. I'll have a bit to say about the nature of what happened in the expulsion of the Jews and this category called conversos, sort of Jews and non-Jews, Jewish converts. So what are they? Are they Christians? Aren't they Christians? How do the Jews relate to them? How do the Christians relate to them? Nobody knows quite what to do about them. And that creates a problem and really is an important problem and an important factor in the expulsion of the Jews in 1492. And you'll see, how that works, I think, a little bit more in the comments that I made. We're also going to talk about Jewish mysticism a bit and the mystical approach that came after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. So you have a little bit of reading there. And I asked you to think about the concept of tikkun as it exists in the mystical universe, not simply tikkun olam as we think about it in terms of social justice. And then to talk about a little bit the early modern period with regard to rationalism and the Enlightenment, and you'll have reading about, from Spinoza and about Spinoza. I think Spinoza is sort of the key to the modern sensibility with regard to religion. And you'll see that. You'll see a little bit about his approach. The problem is we have such little time to do this. And I spent a lot of time in the medieval period, so now we're jumping and we're going to get into the modern stuff as well, and I hope we'll have sufficient time to do justice to it. But these 2 centuries have a lot of different things in them, and we're just going to have to combine them together. So I hope you have a good week, and I'll be interested in any comments that you have on this video.